early, okay, we will continue. Okay. An early military experience for Sharon was a terrible battle at Letron. Most of you have probably been to Israel, and there's a wonderful tank museum there, and we have a picture of okay, but let's go down to the tank museum. There's a tank on a huge pillar standing up. You can see it for almost miles away. There was a battle at Letron in the 48 war. Sharon is badly wounded, and he learned a military dictum that is the absolute foundation of Israeli military laws and so forth. It stayed with him the rest of his life. You never abandon your comrades. You never leave a body behind. You never leave someone, even if they're badly wounded. No one is ever left on the battlefield, whether dead or alive. And I think we know this in current Israeli. Remember the 5-year imprisonment of Shalit in Gaza. Like many Israelis, he leaves once the state was established on May the 7th, 1948. And we have the next picture. Here's the proclamation of the state. The state is established. Sharon goes to the United States. A lot of Israelis do this. They get a car, they buy an old car, and they drive across the United States. Sharon now feels that he's a man of the world. Early in his military life, he became famous for an anti-terrorist operation at Kibbutz, which is in Jordan, with Unit 101. And let's have the next picture, please. There had been a lot of terrorists. The terrorists then were called the Fedayeen, and they were attacking Israel from the West Bank. And they went into Jordan and they did a massacre. They blew up Arab homes. There were some 65 civilian deaths in this little town. 50 Arab Palestinian homes were demolished. And the charge concerning this raid stuck with Sharon for the rest of his life. And the next picture, please. And here you see the mainstream media trying to whitewash Sharon, which they couldn't do. David Ben-Gurion, and we'll have the next picture, please. Here he is with his 2 tufts of hair. David Ben-Gurion strongly backed Sharon, and Sharon always was one of Ben-Gurion's favorites. Now that the stage is set for Sharon's toughness, his valor, and brutality, let us go back to the beginning. And the next picture, please. He's born February the 26th, 1928, in a village called Kfar Kfila. Kfar means village, I believe. It's an agricultural moshav in British Mandate Palestine. His parents were Samuel Schneiderman, and they came from Brest-Litovsk, and Vera Schneiderman. She came actually from Mogilev, and both of them were from the Russian Tsarist Empire. His parents met at Tiflis in Georgia. That's where Stalin was born. And his father was an agronomist. And that accounts for Sharon's tremendous love of farming. And his mother, Vera, studied medicine. So his parents were very intellectual, very smart. They both came on what's called the Third Aliyah in 1922. They settled in Kfar Malal, which is a socialist moshav. Most of the moshavs and kibbutzes were quite left, quite socialist. Originally, both their parents were Mapai labor members, and they were very secular. Sharon was asked by Ben-Gurion to Hebraize his name. So from Schneiderman, it became Sharon. Sharon was never religious, but he had a deep faith and a foundation of everything Jewish and Zionist. He was connected with all the great leaders of early Israel. An early friend in the next picture was Moshe Dayan. And we have a picture of Moshe. Here he is. Last week we had a picture of Moshe without the eye patch before he lost his eye. This celebrated one-eyed general. He was also connected to Yitzhak Rabin. We have a picture of Yitzhak Rabin, and to Ben-Gurion. Sharon always seemed to be involved in bloody battles. Sometimes some of the other military people thought he made more of the battles than he should have, sometimes through his own initiative. He was definitely heroic. He was also reckless. After the 48 war, Israel and Sharon were constantly fighting these anti-terrorist actions such as the Kibbutz raid that I described. And just before the 1956 Sinai campaign, Sharon mounts a particularly bloody reprisal raid. Moshe Dayan was incensed at Sharon, and he said to him, "You have no deference to casualties, especially the Israeli dead." And Sharon's retort to Moshe Dayan was, "The dead are dead and the living are living." And the next picture, which is, I'm sorry, it's me. This is the Sinai campaign. We'll come back to that. That's out of place, but that'll give you an idea of the Sinai campaign. It's hard to judge what Sharon was accomplished with these heavy number of deaths on both sides. Let's go to the October 56 war. As we recall in previous lectures, Israel, Great Britain, and France collaborated in the 1956 campaign. They wanted to get back to control of the Suez Canal that Nasser had seized. And I had described the meeting at Sèvres, France, where Peres and Ben-Gurion went, and they were really snubbed by all the executives and big generals from France and Britain. And Ben-Gurion, who didn't want to be recognized, he wore a trilby hat to cover up those two big tufts of hair. The 56 war had three objectives: maul the Egyptian army, break the blockage at the States of Tehran. You know, to blockade a country is a cause of war, and stop the Fedayeen. And a key battle in the 56 war was the Mitla Pass. And Sharon, the Israelis dropped paratroopers at the pass. It's in the middle of the Sinai. And in the entire Sinai campaign, they lost 172 soldiers, but 38 of them were at the Mitla Pass battle. And many of the officers, Mordechai Gur, who later became chief of command, said that Sharon didn't do the job. Was it professional jealousy, Jewish-Israeli politics, truth, or fiction? 2 months after the battle, Samuel Schneiderman, his father, dies of cancer in December 1956. And then just 10 years later, Israel faced its next challenge in June 1967. Now, let's go to the next picture, please. So here we can see the States of Tehran. The Egyptians blocked it, and Uthant, the UN Secretary General, withdraws the peacekeepers that our Nobel Prize winning Prime Minister Lester Pearson had put in. So the next picture, please. Lester Pearson was a wonderful prime minister. He came up with this brilliant idea that they're still trying to use, UN peacekeepers with blue helmets. But the Secretary General of the UN, Uthant, he withdrew them because Nasser put on pressure, and that led to the 67 war. Now, I've mentioned before, but I think it's worth repeating, before June 1967, Israel was under tremendous stress. Nobody knew that they could achieve such a tremendous victory. They dug mass graves, and I described how Eshkol got on the radio and he stuttered and he stammered, and the whole country was having a nervous breakdown. And Yitzhak Rabin was so stressed, he had to go to the hospital with nicotine and caffeine intoxication. But June the 6th, 1967, we destroyed the Egyptian and Syrian air forces. We had an amazing victory. We recaptured the old city. Sharon contributed with a textbook perfect battle plan at Abu Nagila. And we have the next picture, please. and he basked in the joy of victory. In the meantime, he lost his oldest child, Gur, from his first wife due to a tragic gun accident. They had a rifle and two little kids were fooling around and the child got shot to death. Sharon had been married to Margalit Sharon, and she passed away in 1962. Subsequently, which I think is a little unusual, he marries Lily, Margalit's sister. Gur, the child, had been playing with an antique rifle. Sharon was devastated, and that was only 5 years after his first wife died. That terrible event resonated with Sharon for the rest of his life. And the next picture, please. Now, here we can see the West Bank, and we can see the Israeli settlements. And if we're going to have a peace, those red zones, one of them is Madal Adumim that I never pronounced right. The other one is Ariel. Those will be retained by Israel, and they'll trade some of the Negev for them. That's the thinking. Well, as soon as the end of the Six-Day War, Sharon became part of the colonizing effect of the West Bank. And I mentioned again, and it's worth repeating, the Arab League had a meeting after the Six-Day War in June of '67. They came up with their famous 3 no's. No Israel, no negotiation, and nothing. So as a result, and Israel really was in a position in July of 1967 probably to give back most of the West Bank, certainly not Jerusalem. So they began to build these settlements. At this point, Sharon's head of IDF training, but he promotes the settlements. In 1969, Sharon resigns from the army, and then following the war of attrition, I'll talk more about the war of attrition in one of the Bibi lectures. The war of attrition was a battle between Egypt and Israel along the Suez Canal in 1970 to about 1971. And it was a terrible thing, especially for the Egyptians. Sharon rejoins the army. He builds an extensive line of fortifications along the Suez Canal called the Bar Lev line. And that was to play a key part in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Sharon takes over southern command of the Israeli army. So we have southern command being the Sinai Peninsula and northern command being the Golan Heights. And his next brush with confrontation concerns the expulsion and brutalization of some 10,000 Bedouin tribesmen in the Sinai. They had to get them out. They wanted to have a security zone, but Sharon did it in his typical bulldozer style. They covered it up by military censorship, but you know, you have a left-wing Israeli press and the politicians, they got a hold of it and they wouldn't let go. In the meantime, it's 1970, before the Yom Kippur War. Sharon foresaw the future. No one could say he wasn't very smart and prophetic. He practiced canal crossing, deployments with giant metal rafts and pontoon bridges. And we have to give them.
So opening them to me was like.
Jerry, can you please unmute yourself? We cannot hear you. And I will ask everyone to keep themselves muted. Thank you.
Okay, right. I don't know how that happened. Was that long?
Yeah, you are on. We can hear you.
Yeah, okay. You can hear me now. Okay, so it's the summer of 1973. Sharon sees a future for himself in politics. He's chief of the Southern Command. David Al-Azhar is the Northern Command, and they couldn't get along. They liked each other. And as we know, October the 6th, 1973, well, the next picture, please. There's David Al-Azhar and Sharon, at least are talking to one another. And Northern Command for Al-Azhar, Southern Command for Sharon. And the next picture, please. what happened? At this point, Ephraim Katsir was the president of Israel, which is a ceremonial office. We can sum up Israel's initial defeats in the 73 Yom Kippur War with the Hebrew word that I won't pronounce right, conceptia, concept, blind arrogance, hurubas, failure to anticipate, failure of the government. Everyone was to blame. The army, the media, the academics were all to blame. That's what President Katsir said. There was an Israeli election scheduled for October the 21st, 1973. Sharon's the campaign coordinator for the new Likud party. And let's have the next picture, please. The Likud party was an amalgam of right-wing parties. It was formerly Herut. Herut was the name of the party when Begin ran it. But we have this surprise attack on Yom Kippur, October the 6th, and I'll never, ever forget. Let me please just give you a personal reflection. We were in synagogue, of course, on October the 6th. It also happens to be our anniversary. And somebody had told the rabbi, we were at Bet Tikva synagogue, someone had told him that Israel had been attacked in a surprise attack. And I remember the rabbi stopping the services and crying out to God, please, let us prevail. And the next picture, please. This is the Bar Lev line. There were only 500 Israeli soldiers on the whole line, which was terribly inadequate. And this is a long stretch of many miles along the whole Suez Canal. That was overrun. There were a lot of prisoners taken. 2,500 Israeli soldiers died in the war. That's a huge loss. The Egyptians were very well prepared. They knew the tremendous superiority of the Israeli Air Force, so the Russians had given them these SAM missiles. SAM means surface-to-air missiles, and many Phantom jets were lost. Many tanks were lost due to the SAG rockets, another Russian thing. The initial days were a disaster. A tremendous amount of dissension and arguments amongst the commander. How can we proceed? Now, if you think about it, the Sinai is a big place. The Egyptians were afraid. They were probably afraid the Israelis might use a nuclear weapon. So they didn't go very far. Also, they didn't want to go away from their umbrella of their SAM missiles. So they had a lot of depth. Elazar was a very smart guy. He realized Israel was far more vulnerable in the north with the Syrian surprise attack. So he transferred an armored brigade up, and the Syrians are stopped at a vital bridge junction called Bnei Yaakov, something like that. Now, Israel is losing planes, they're losing tanks, they're in big trouble. What do we do? Golda Meir is the prime minister. She appeals to Nixon and Kissinger. They held back. They were pressuring Israel. They felt this was the way. Finally, Golda said, look, if you don't give me the weapons, I'm going public to the Jewish people in America. And at that time, all the Jewish people were behind Israel. So eventually they rearm and they fly in more jets to Israel, more tanks and so forth. They kept thinking about Sharon's idea of crossing the canal and coming behind the two Egyptian armies. The generals, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, they continued to feud about what to be done. The battles wore on. And the next picture, please. Here's Sharon. He on purpose, he likes the press, and he has a little bit of a cut on his forehead, so he makes sure he gets it in the pictures. And the next picture, please. And here we have the canal crossing. So Sharon persuades them. He had thought about this for a long time, and they crossed the canal in two places. And they have these rafts and pontoon bridges and so forth. And they trapped the two Egyptian armies. And the Egyptian armies were surrounded. And they didn't have any water, any food. If it would have gone on much longer, Egypt would completely collapse. But Nixon and Kissinger didn't want that. So the Israelis have stopped. In the end, the verdict is without Sharon's perspicacity and perseverance, the canal would have not been crossed. Sharon had turned defeat into victory, and really he becomes king of Israel, Melech B'Israel. If the Yom Kippur War was Israel's Pearl Harbor, then Sharon becomes General Douglas MacArthur. Arrogant, swashbuckling, manipulated, loved or hated, contemptuous of authority. After the war and the dead were counted, it was a terrible toll for a small country. As I mentioned, 2,500 dead. Some in Israel called it the War of the Generals, and it was in part the election campaign of December 1973, and the Israeli public still voted Labor, and Likud and Menachem Begin did not win. Likud had 39 seats in the Knesset, and Labor continues to have a coalition of 51 seats in the 120-member Knesset. They formed a commission, the Agranat Commission, the deficiencies of Israel in the conduct of the war, and they really tore the country apart. Now, our first visit to Israel was in 1975. I have to tell you, I can still remember, it was a down place. They were very, very upset. Although they had eventually won the war, they were very, very upset. Sharon was very much against the disengagement with Egypt that Henry Kissinger put in. In the meantime, the settler movement, Gushanim, found some major settlement at Sebastian in the West Bank. Sharon thinks Begin has lost 7 successive elections since the state was formed, and he would never win. But Sharon was wrong. In 1977, and the next picture, please. Here's a picture of Kissinger, who pressured Israel quite a bit. And the next one, yeah, this is spelled wrong. It should be J-A-B, Jabotinsky. I'm sorry for all of those who like Jabotinsky, but Begin wins the election, and at midnight, when he's realizes he's won the election, he goes down to visit his mentor's grave, Jabotinsky. Sharon had formed a new party, center-right, called Shlomazim, and he promised neither Likud or Labor that he would join with the coalition, and eventually he joins with Likud with Menachem Begin. And they decide to pursue a new peace initiative with the Arabs, but not with the Palestinians. Following the treaty in 1977, if you remember, Sadat comes to Israel, and Israel, as part of the agreement, had to withdraw from a beautiful place that we had visited in the Sinai called Yamit, right on the water. And it was terrible. But it was a good precedent for Sharon, because later on, when they withdraw from Gaza, they knew what to do. It's 1980, and Sharon is Minister of Defense in the Begin government. There were continual problems with the PLO, problems in Lebanon. Sharon decides and persuades Menachem Begin, the prime minister, they're going to invade Lebanon. And in 1982, there was the first Lebanon war. And as I mentioned, Lebanon is a terribly fractionated place between the Maronites, the Christians, the Catholics, the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Armenians, the Druze, and so forth. Sharon thought that he could make an alliance with Bashir Gamal's Christian Phalange Party, very right-wing, and he meets with Bashir Gamal. And the next picture, please. And here's Menachem Begin at Camp David when they make the agreement with Egypt. And the next picture, please. Here's the PLO flag. They're having all these problems. And the next picture, please. Shlomo Agrov was the Israeli ambassador to London. And Sharon needed an excuse to attack Lebanon. And he had made this idea of having this alliance with Bashir Gamal and the Christian Phalangists. So Shlomo Agrov is attacked in London by the PLO. He's badly wounded. He never recovers. And this is the excuse. So on June the 2nd, 1982, they begin the invasion of Lebanon. It was called Operation Peace for Galilee. We have to understand Lebanon is a mountainous country, difficult for tanks, and they have these crusader castles that can be strongholds. Sharon misled Begin and the cabinet. It's clear Begin especially did not know what was happening. Sharon was the executor, and they advanced, they said, only to the Litani River, halfway up Lebanon. But they kept going. They went all the way up to Beirut. They fought with the Syrians that they wiped out. There was a famous battle with the Syrians called Sultan Yaqub. They destroyed the Syrians, but 3 Israeli soldiers were captured, which they never got back. In the end, they attacked West Beirut. They forced the PLO to be evacuated, and Arafat and the PLO are evacuated to Tunis. They have a siege of Beirut. Ronald Reagan is now the president of America, Caspar Weinberger. They offer good terms at Camp David. It's rejected by Begin. Sharon says the terrorists are still in Beirut. And then Bashir Gamal is assassinated by the Syrians. Okay, so Bashir Gamal is the leader of the Christian Phalange. He's blown up by a Syrian truck bomb. And as a result, next picture, please. Okay, and we can skip over our friend Arafat, the Sabra Shatila massacre. So let me be very clear about what happened here. The Christian Phalange, not the Israelis, go into the Palestinian camps and murder about 600 Palestinians. They absolute horrible murders, rapes and disembowelments and everything terrible. And this happened to be on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And Begin's listening to the BBC, and he makes a very insensitive remark, which is the next picture, please. Goyim kill Goyim, and they blame the Jews. Well, to a certain extent, Israel was responsible. No Israeli shot even one Palestinian. The Christian Phalange murdered all these people, but Israel was occupying that area, and they should have realized and taken precautions. They knew that the Phalange was going to do that. Sharon is excoriated in the Kahan Commission. The Israeli left is very angry. The whole world blames Israel. And it was a very interesting thing. Sharon sues Time magazine for libel, and he wins $1. So that really probably sums up the whole thing. Sharon is fired as defense minister, and he goes to his Sycamore ranch, and he's under siege. In the meantime, Lebanon falls down into a civil war, which lasts till 1991. And by then, Hezbollah, which is a Shiite organization, majority of the Muslims in Lebanon are Shiite, and they hold sway. Israel tries to ally itself with the southern Lebanese Christian army, Major Saad Haddad. They want to secure the northern border. And they stay in Lebanon to the year 2000. And in that time, they lost 500 soldiers. It was very bad. And Ehud Barak was wise enough to pull out Israel completely out of Lebanon in the year 2000. There's no question that Lebanon was Israel's Vietnam. Sharon is now a farmer. He's breeding ewes. He works on flowers and trees. August the 28th, 1983, Begin falls apart. His wife died when he visited Reagan in America, and he just couldn't take it. People were picketing his house constantly because of the casualties in Lebanon. Begin resigns, and he simply says, "I cannot anymore." And the next prime minister is Yitzhak Shamir. This little tough guy. He always had his hand, you can't see what I'm doing, but he always crossed his hands, which means I don't want to negotiate. Sharon turns himself into the victim. He writes scathing essays in Yechodot Aronot. He criticized everybody. Everybody fights with him. But somehow in 1984, he becomes Minister of Industry, Trade, and Commerce. He serves there till 1990. We would call him a backbencher, but he wanted to get back into public life. And then in 1987, the first Intifada breaks out. It lasted 3 years. Intifada sort of means a riot. You know the program Fauda, it's a riot. 1,200 Palestinians were dead. 500 collaborators were murdered by their own people, by their own Palestinians. Thousands were arrested. Sharon becomes housing minister. They tried to keep him out of defense. We have to say that Sharon did a great job. This was the point where they had this huge influx of Soviet immigrants that absolutely transformed the country. And I remember one guy saying to us, which was a very clever statement, you know, before we used to export to you flowers and watermelons and oranges. Now we transport to you little computer chips, little boxes of computer chips, and we make way more money. That was the transformation of Israel. And then, next picture, please. So this is this huge influx of Russian Jews. Some of them were not halakhically Jewish. They may have had a Jewish father, but not a Jewish mother. Some of them may not have been any connection, but 1 million came in and they transformed the country. Next picture, please. And we thoroughly discussed Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. Oslo Accords went down the drain. And following, and the next picture, please. Bus number 18 was bombed twice. Sharon's out of office. He rails against government ineptitude, and it was a terrible time. I remember going in the early 90s, and, excuse me, we used to see the signs, "Welcome brave tourists." Sharon was Minister of Energy and Water Resources from 1996 to 1999. And then he goes into foreign affairs. He makes all kinds of connections. As I mentioned, in the year 2000, Barak pulls out of Lebanon. And then in March 7th, 2001, and it's like the Nixon comeback. If you remember, Richard Nixon lost to Kennedy in 1960. In 1962, Nixon runs for governor of California and he loses. And he throws a temper tantrum and he says, the press won't have me to kick around anymore. And then, of course, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson is elected president. But in 1968, Nixon, on a law and order platform, wins the presidency. While Sharon becomes like Nixon. Sharon becomes the prime minister, the king of Israel. His second wife, Lily, dies, and he never saw Sharon crowned as the king of Israel. Sharon goes and visits the Temple Mount, and he instigated a wave of unrest that ultimately led to the Second Intifada or uprising. And in the Second Intifada, there weren't stones, there were bombs and guns. And a popular view and we're not sure what instigated the second intifada. Was it Sharon visiting the Temple Mount? And I mentioned to you, the Muslims are hysterical about any tampering with the Temple Mount. But Arafat probably had something to do with it. So the consensus is that Sharon's visit, while ill-advised, was the perfect pretext for Arafat to start the Intifada. And Sharon's visit was the perfect symbol. He was the most despised Israeli politician could have come. Ill-advised understatement. Now that he's prime minister, he refashions his image completely. He's going to be a leader for peace. He adopts a new motto, restraint is strength. And let's put up his motto. Okay, that's his wife, Lily, who's by this time passed away with his grandson. And the next picture, restraint is strength. And the next picture, to restrain yourself in some of the horrible terrorist attacks that I think some of us have somewhat forgotten. The Dolphinarium was a discotheque on the water in Tel Aviv, on the beach, and about 20 or 30 Israeli young people were lined up to get into the discotheque, and a suicide bomber slipped into the lineup and blew himself up. And you can see the aftermath. Sharon holds back on the retaliation, and Arafat intrudes more. Finally, Sharon moves. And the next picture, please. Operation Defensive Shield. They attacked the West Bank. There was another terrible suicide bombing in Netanya at a Passover Seder. That was the last call. I think as prime minister, it's fair to say maybe he metamorphosized into a wise leader. By March 2002, Israel's main cities had become ghost towns because of the bombings. People wouldn't use buses, and I probably mentioned this to my friend who had to travel to Jerusalem to visit the super farm stores. He was afraid to follow a bus in case the bus was blown up. The Netanya bombing at the Park Hotel in Netanya was Israel 9/11. That was the turning point. So Operation Defensive Shield was launched. All the major West Bank cities except Jericho and Hebron. Now, there's something that's important. There was a town called Jenin, which was the center point of the terrorists. Originally, the Arabs said 5,000 people were murdered in Jenin. Then they said 500 people. Then it got down to 50. Unfortunately, we have to understand the Palestinians exaggerate tremendously. And eventually, a UN commission exonerated Israel from the Jenin massacre. 23 Israeli soldiers were killed and 52 Palestinians, mostly armed. In Operation Defensive Shield, there were 260 Palestinians killed, 2,000 arrested, and there were 34 dead, and most of those were in Jenin. As a result, Sharon, in the next picture, the wall was built. Now, Sharon's popularity soars after the operation. He lifted the intense depression that had affected the entire country. Some Israeli settlements were inside the wall, some were not, and we can debate how they're going to do it. In some cases, Palestinian villages were divided. There was a long debate about the path of the separation fence, but there's no debate the wall cut the terrorism drastically. As Prime Minister, Sharon was very uncomfortable in the Prime Minister's office. He really wanted to be in the ranch and sit in front of the fireplace in a blanket. He ate a prodigious amount. His favorite food was loof, which is Israeli meatloaf in a can. And he would send out for lunch with a big takeout that took 2 people to carry the falafel from a nearby stand. There was a constant debate about anti-terrorist attacks and collateral damage. One of the people that was really an insider was somebody we dealt with last week, Sheikh Yassin. Next picture, please. He was made a quadriplegic in one assassination attempt or killing attempt, and then he was finally killed. In the meantime, unfortunately, there was a lot of corruption allegations about Sharon and his son Omri in a Greek island resort. Next picture, please. Okay. In April 2005, we had another of the endless peace initiatives. Every American president wants to make peace in the Middle East. If Biden is smart, he will stay out of it, but that's another story. So we had what was called the Quartet. The Quartet was the United Nations, Russia, United States, and the European Union. Sharon says we will make painful concessions. Sharon says there'll be a Palestinian state. There'll be a 2-state solution. Next picture, please. We will give up biblical Jewish places like Shiloh and Bethel. We will pull away from Bethlehem. That was a difficult statement for Sharon to make. His aides analyzed Sharon wants to make peace, but he doesn't trust Arafat. We have to make credit for Sharon. Despite the continuation of the terrorist attacks, the burial site for Israeli soldiers, the nationwide trauma, Sharon pressed for his quest for peace. He's pushing the peace. February 2nd, 2005, Sharon unilaterally on his own announces withdrawal and disengagement from Gaza. They had 4 settlements in Gaza. There was a tremendous uproar in the whole country, but the only member of the Knesset that lived in Gaza said it's not the right thing. In the middle of this, there was a terrorist attack in Kativ, a settlement in Gaza. A mother and her 4 daughters were killed. That almost sidelined the removal, but public opinion was behind Gaza. More and more Israeli soldiers were killed defending a couple of thousand settlers in Gaza. He used the same tactics that he used in Yamit. They went to Gaza, to the settlements. They used thousands of army, police. They used helicopters and cages, and they pulled out of Gaza. And there was an interesting poll on the television tonight on PBS. They were saying 67% of Israelis think there'll be another fight with Hamas in Gaza within the next year. And then they're probably right. Most Israelis supported the disengagement from Gaza. And we want to look for a moment, the next picture. The demographics are not good if you want to continue the status quo. You can look, the Arabs are having so many more children than the non-Jews. The disengagement has dominated the last year and a half of Sharon's life, but they had little bloodshed. The wall was a factor. And then January the 4th, 2006, Sharon has a massive stroke. And he never emerged from the vegetative state. He had had a minor stroke previously, and there was some controversy he wasn't treated well. He finally passes away January the 11th, 2014. He had become a larger-than-life figure. Huda Merit succeeds Sharon, and Huda Merit went into the Second Lebanese War in 2006. I went during the war. It was a tough time in Israel with Hezbollah and all their rockets. They're much more of an opponent than Hamas. So let us conclude about Ariel Sharon and his effect on the history of modern Israel. And next picture. Yehuda Merit went to jail for corruption. I'm sorry. But he did try and make peace. And the next picture. So Ariel Sharon lasts in this coma till January the 11th, 2014. He was a very complicated man. His style and emotions vacillated from the extreme bellicose war maker to the careful peacemaker. I think in the end, he wanted to make peace, but he was a bulldozer. He had little regard for life. In the end, he became a peacemaker. He had run shot over his army colleagues and political opponents, but we have to say he was not religious. He was a Zionist through and through. Above all, he was a Jew who cared deeply about the Jewish people. He had two lasting monuments to his achievements: the crossing of the Canal, the Sinai Canal, in October 1973, which turned defeat into victory, and the disengagement from Gaza. Now, some people complain rockets are still raining on Sderot and other southern communities, but there are very few deaths, one or two here or there, and every life is precious. But the 5,000, or I'm sorry, there were 9,000 Israeli settlers and the huge garrison of IDF troops. It was not worth it. Sharon was a great man, but very complicated. Okay, let's get rid of the PowerPoint, and we have a few minutes for questions. If you raise your hand, we'll know you have a question. Anybody? I hope I haven't put anybody to sleep, but it's a tough talk. Anybody at all with a question or comment? So I mentioned at the beginning, I think that it's very hard to say how this coalition government will work. The ideologies of this coalition government are too spread out. To have a extreme left-wing party like Meretz, together with Naftali Bennett, who's extremely right-wing, maybe more than Bibi was, I don't think it's going to work. Okay, questions? Going once, going twice. There's no hockey game tonight. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, I wish you all well. I want to thank Fergana again for great work. And next week, we will be talking about the first part of Bibi, which mainly deals with his life. The following week, we will talk about Ehud Barak, who I think is